Hi, I'm Chris, and this is going to be a feature-length tutorial in which I'm going to be making a 2D adventure game using Adventure Creator. Adventure Creator is a toolkit for making adventure games with Unity, and this is going to be done with Unity 4.6, but Adventure Creator works just as well with the newly released Unity 5. If you want to know how to work in a 3D environment, if you want to make a 3D game, there's a separate tutorial for that. But I should point out that is a little bit more advanced, not because 3D is more advanced, but just because I'm leaving the basics to this tutorial. And this tutorial, whether you're working in 2D or 3D, is a really good primer because we're going to be covering things like hotspots and interactions and conversations and all the rest of it. So, all I've done at the moment is imported the base Adventure Creator package, only the asset files. I haven't imported my inputs or layers. So let's go and do that now. The best way to set up your Adventure Creator project is to basically just run the demo and see any errors that it throws up and deal with them. There's only a couple of changes we need to make. So let's go and run the 2D demo. I'll go up to the top here and choose Adventure Creator, Getting Started, and then Load 2D Demo Managers. I need to load the managers of any game before we actually run the scene. You can have as many games in a project as you want, but you do have to load the managers before you switch projects. So I'm going to go to Adventure Creator, 2D Demo Scenes, and then load up the 2D demo scene by clicking on Park. And I'll just run the scene and see what happens in the console. So we've got a couple of error messages. First is can't find the layer nav mesh. So let's go and create a new layer. I'm going to go to Edit, Project Settings, Tags and Layers. And I'll just create a new layer called nav mesh. Capital N, capital N. The other error is can't find the input button menu. So let's create a new input. I'll go to Edit, Project Settings again, this time Input. And I'm going to create a new axis just by increasing the size by 1. I'll rename it Menu, and I'll set the positive button to Escape, but I'll remove joystick button 1 as the alternative. And now if I rerun the scene, we'll be able to play the demo game without any problems. And that means that Adventure Creator is now set up for us to create our own. You can have as many Adventure Creator games in a Unity project as you like. Each Adventure Creator game needs its own set of managers, which is how Unity knows which Adventure Creator game to run. Now, when we went to the 2D demo here, the first thing we had to do was load in the 2D demo managers. So the first thing we're going to do is create our own set of managers for our new game. This isn't a per scene setting, this is just a per game setting. So we're going to be starting completely from scratch. So I'm going to go to File, New Scene, and then up at the top, Getting Started, New Game Wizard. And I'll just fill in the boxes and have it create the managers for us. So I'll choose Next, give ourselves a game name. I'm going to be very creative and call it My 2D Game. Choose Next. We then have to choose our camera perspective, and we're going to leave it as the default 2D. Next again. Interface, how do we want to interact with hotspots? Adventure Creator can be used to set up a variety of different interface types, but I'm going to leave it at the moment as context sensitive, which is the most basic interface type. It's the simplest to use, it's the simplest to get your head around. If you want to know some more advanced techniques, the 3D demo is going to cover choose hotspot in interaction mode, but we'll leave it as context sensitive now. Next again, our GUI system. Now we can either make a blank one or use Unity UI, but here I'm going to just go with default AC, which will give us a default interface that we can make a game with. We can always change it later on. Next again, we'll just confirm everything and choose Finish. And you can see now, beneath my Adventure Creator folder, I have a folder called My 2D Game. And in that, I have a set of managers that's in this Manager folder. And my managers are loaded into this Manager Package asset file that's just within this My 2D Game folder. If I select it, I can see all of my manager assets are listed here. And in the same way that I went to load 2D demo managers up here to load in the 2D demo, I can load in these managers just by clicking Assign Managers. And now we're ready to start making our game. I'm going to be making use of the 2D demo assets that comes with Adventure Creator. You can use your own if you like, but this is just so that if you want to follow along exactly, then you can do that. Notice that in the hierarchy window, we now have a whole bunch of new scene objects. A lot of these are just scene folders, as I call them. If I click on, say, cutscenes, there's no components attached to it. It's placed at the origin. And you'll see that as we create game logic, Adventure Creator will place objects into scene folders as appropriate, and it just helps to reduce scene clutter. Now I'm going to find the 2D demo graphics in Assets, Adventure Creator, 2D Demo, Graphics, Sprites, and finally Park. And I'm going to drag in not all of them, I'll just drag in, say, Park Sky, Park Ground, Park Background, and finally Park Tree. First thing we want to do is rearrange these so that they're displayed properly. Now, first I'm going to click on Park Sky, which is going to be at the bottom. And the order in which sprites are displayed in Unity is determined by their order and layer property. So I'm going to give this a negative, or rather an order and layer of -10, just so that it's always guaranteed to be at the bottom. Next is going to be the Park Background, which is this one. I'm going to give this an order and layer of -5, which is in between -10 and 0, which is what the ground is going to be at. And finally, I've got the tree, which I'm going to bring down here. I'm going to give it an order and layer of +5, even though it looks all right at the moment. We'll see why later, but I'm going to give it an order and layer of +5. And maybe I'll shrink it down a little bit as well. Finally, just a bit of housekeeping, I'm going to select these 4 objects and place them in the Set Geometry folder. And then if I collapse that, they're then hidden from view so that we can now work a bit easier when we create new objects. So now let's open up the main game window that Adventure Creator uses. If I go up to the top here, Adventure Creator, Editors, Game Editor, we now have it's a very vertical window, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to dock it over here so that we can make good use of this vertical space I have. And each of these buttons here at the top represent the different managers that we created using the new game wizard. So we have our settings manager, our actions manager, but for this moment I'm going to just be working in the scene manager, which manages all of our variables local to this particular scene. So the first thing we want to do is set up our default nav mesh. And the nav mesh is, well, when we have a player walking through the scene, we want the player to navigate around things like the tree. We don't want him to walk around the sky and things like that. So we use a nav mesh to dictate where the player can and can't go. So we have our default nav mesh field up here. Right now it's blank. And we can create a new one by going down to the bottom here. We have a list of scene prefabs, as you can see, and then different categories of prefabs. And underneath navigation, I'm going to choose Nav Mesh 2D and double-click it, so that we've now got a new Nav Mesh 2D field, new Nav Mesh 2D object in our scene. And you can see it's represented by this this pentagon here. A little bit hard to see it because it's white, but if you're familiar with Unity, this is a polygon collider. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring it down here. And I'm basically going to reshape it so that it covers the area that we want the player to be able to walk. If I choose the inspector and then edit collider, then I can rearrange these, each of these points here. I'm not going to be super accurate, just accurate enough to get the point across. Something like that should be fine. Now we notice that we have, I'll check how to get collider there. Notice that we also have a hole in the middle, or we're going to need a hole in the middle because this is where our tree is, and otherwise the player will be walking straight through the tree. So I'm going to create a new polygon collider. I'm going to go to Game Object, Create Empty. I'll rename this object to, say, Tree Hole. I'll reset its transform and add the component Polygon Collider. And as you can see, we've now got another one of these pentagons. So I'm going to position it at the bottom base of the tree. And again, choosing Edit Collider to edit the points, I'm going to just rearrange them so that they roughly cover the base of the tree. Again, I'm not going to be too accurate. It's just really a demonstration. Uncheck Edit Collider to stop editing it. And now we just, well, first I'll drag this tree hole object into my navmesh folder. And then I want to register this as a hole within our regular navmesh. So I'm going to select the navmesh 2D. And then we have a field here called number of holes. I'm going to change that to 1. And then this, well, we have now one hole field. So I'm going to drag my tree hole into the hole field here. And then that's now registered. So if I were to run the game and then go back to the scene, this hole is now a part of this polygon collider. So I can move it around and you can see the hole is now moving with the outer rim as well. We now just need to register this as the default nav mesh because we can have various nav meshes that might block the player from walking around all of the scene at some later point if that's what we want to do in the game. But this will be our default nav mesh. So in our game editor within the scene manager, remember up here we had our default nav mesh field. I'm going to drag that into there so that our nav mesh 2D object is our default nav mesh. You can see also here we've got a setting called player start, and that's already been assigned as our player start 2D. I can click on that to select it here. And well, it's hiding behind this camera right now, so let's move it out a little bit. And you can see it's represented by this blue arrow, and the position and rotation of this arrow will dictate where the player is by default. So I'm going to move it down here and then rotate it so that it's facing downwards, so that when we have a player, he's going to be facing downwards. Now the point of this default player start is that you can have many player starts in a scene. If I actually select the player start in the inspector, we've got a previous scene variable here. So if we enter this scene from another scene, Adventure Creator will look for the appropriate player start to use, and if it can't find one, or if we start the game from this scene, it will rely on this default player start. To create a new player, we'll first start with a new empty game object. Choose Create, Create Empty at the top of the hierarchy, and I'll rename the new player to My Player. We'll tag it as Player, and then add the component Player. The animation engine that we get, the animation engine setting that we get right at the top determines how our player will be rendered. Sprites Unity is the default. We can change it to Legacy or Mechanim if we were working in 3D. Sprites Unity Complex is if we want more control over our Mechanim finite state manager, but Sprites Unity, which is the default, works for most purposes when it comes to 2D games. So we'll leave it at that for now. We need to add the player sprite itself as a child of this game object. So we'll find it, again I'm going to be using the 2D demo assets, we'll find it in Adventure Creator, 2D Demo, Graphics, Sprites, Brain, and then Brain Idle. For now, I'll use the idle_d sprite. It doesn't actually matter which sprite we use for the moment because we'll be overriding it with animation, but I'll use the idle_d, which I should point out has a pivot at the bottom so that he's pivoting around his feet. I'm going to make this a child object of the player by dragging it onto the player like this, and then I'll reset the transform so that they're both at the same point. And finally, I'll take the idle_d sprite and I'll assign it as the sprite child transform field that appears in the standard 2D animations panel. Finally, I'll make this a prefab. I'll place it in my 2D game, like so, and we'll register this as our game's default player, so that if no player exists in this scene, it can be loaded in automatically. We'll go to the game editor, and in the scene manager, as we've seen, this is for local for managing local scene objects, whereas the Settings Manager is for game-wide settings. So in the Settings Manager, underneath Character Settings, we've got a field for Player, and it accepts a player prefab. I'll drag the MyPlayer prefab into this field, and now we can actually delete this. If we were to delete this, this object, we'd still have our player when we begin the game. Let's play the scene and see what happens. So now we have our player walking around, except he doesn't walk, he's not animated or anything like that. So let's fix that now. This is going to be a tutorial on working with Unity and working with Unity's animation controllers. So if you need to brush up on how animation works in Unity, you should go and have a look on the official documentation. But again, I'm going to be making use of the demo games animations, which I can find in 2D demo animations and then brain. In here we have a whole bunch of walking, idle, and talking and a few other one-off animations. And you can see they all have an underscore and then a letter underneath it. Underscore L, underscore R, and this refers to the direction that he's facing in when this animation is playing. And what will happen is Adventure Creator will work out which of these animations to play based on which direction he's facing at the time. Back in our inspector for the idle D sprite, I'm going to add a new component, animator, and it requires an animation controller. So let's go and create that now. Back in my My2D game folder, I'll make a new animator controller, which I'll call player controller. And I'll drag this into the sprites animator controller field. Now we need to assign those animations into our controller. So I'll go to Window, Animator, and I'll dock it down here somewhere. Finding the animations again, I will just drag all of them into our animator. And because we're using Sprites Unity as our animation engine, we don't need to worry about transitions between them or anything like that. Adventure Creator will take care of that all for us. We can actually preview some of these animations with the animation window. If I just dock it here again, I select the sprite, and we can look at any of these animations like so. So now we need to assign these animations to our player script. Underneath standard 2D animations, we have various names for all of our animations. Now, we don't need to enter in the underscore and then the letter. As I said, this will be handled automatically. We just need everything up until the underscore. So our idle name, as you can see, is going to be brain idle. The walk name, in the same way, is going to be brain walk. We don't have a run name, so I'll leave that blank. And the talk name is going to be brain talk. We are going to be using multiple directions, and we're working in 8 directions, up, down, left, right, and then the diagonals. So we'll choose diagonal sprites. I'll just apply the prefab, and now when we play the scene, we now have our player walking around playing proper animations. We notice that it's a little bit slow for the movement speed of the animation, so I'm going to increase the walk speed scale in the movement settings panel, maybe about sort of 3, something like that. Maybe a little bit more, 3.2 perhaps. So that seems better. When I come out of this scene, remember that Unity will actually undo these changes. So I'm just going to have to do that again once I've stopped playing the scene. 3.2, and I'm going to apply the prefab. And now he's walking around properly. But notice that when we walk in front of the tree, he's displayed underneath it. And that's because his sprite order in layer is not changing. Now remember, when we were setting up our scene geometry, we were affecting the order in layer value for our different backgrounds and tree and things like that. Our tree has an order in layer of 5, whereas our player sprite has an order in layer of 0. But we don't want to just set this to one value because we actually want it to change dynamically as he's walking around the scene. Now we can do that using what's called a sorting map. We can create a sorting map within the scene manager. Up here within our scene settings, we have a field called default sorting map, and I can automatically create one just by clicking create, and it'll be created and assigned. If I click on it, I can access it. And it doesn't look like much at the moment, it's just a empty game object, but I'm going to position it to the top, or just above the topmost point that our player can reach in the nav mesh. Because what I'm going to do is I'm going to break up this nav mesh into two areas, the area behind the tree and the area in front of the tree, and will affect the sorting map, or will affect the sprite in these two regions separately. So I'm going to make the area behind the tree first. Within the inspector, I'm going to click on Add Area. And we now have a new arrow that we can use to position this first region. I'm then going to click Add Area again, and this is our second region. I'm going to move the new arrow down just below the bottommost point of this nav mesh. So now our sorting map is dividing two clear areas in our nav mesh. The numbers beside indicate the sorting order in layer that any sprite that follows it is going to have. So when the player is behind the tree, we want his order in layer to be between 0 and 5. So 1 is fine, but when he's in front of the tree, we want him to have an order in layer that's bigger than 5. So I'll change it from 2 to 7. We now just need to tell the player that he can follow this sorting map. So I'm going to select his sprite and add the follow sorting map component. Check the box. And now if we play the scene, we can see that his order in layer is changing as he's moving around our navigation mesh. And he's always displayed correctly in front of and on top of the tree. But he looks a little bit too big here, and when he walks down here, he's maybe a little bit too small. He's not scaling as he's moving around the scene. And technically, that's because he's not actually moving towards or further away from the camera. He's just in this XY plane. But we can cheat a zooming effect or a depth effect by again going to his sorting map. And you can see we have, sorry, not the sorting map, the actual sorting map instead. And we have a checkbox called Affect Character Scale. And if we check that, it means that we can alter the character's size as he's walking around. The first field that appears is our start scale. Now this is a percentage, so this is the scale that will appear, that he will be when he's at the top of the sorting map. I'm going to change it to something like, say, 70. And our end scale, that is the scale when he's down at the bottom, I'm going to make a little bit bigger than 100%. I'll make it, say, 110. And we can calculate any scales that are in between just by clicking Interpolate in between scales. And you can see it's been set automatically to 87. Now when we run the scene, he will scale up and down as he walks around the scene. And a nice little feature of AC is that if we click on, within the follow sorting map script, if we click on Edit Mode Preview, his scale will actually update without running the game, which makes it just a lot easier to work out what the values should be. Now that we've got a player walking around the scene, let's work on a camera. Now the camera doesn't move as we walk around the scene. We want the camera to be a little bit more zoomed in and follow the player as he walks. But at the moment, we don't have an Adventure Creator camera. We're only relying on the main camera prefab, which doesn't have any control settings. So you can see down here at the bottom in the console, we have an error called Player Start 2D has no camera on start. And that's referring to the Player Start 2D prefab that we have here. This is where the player begins the scene. And every player start has an associated camera on start. So when the player begins from this position, he's also going to have a camera that's going to activate. And just as we have a default player start, we also have a default camera. And in our game editor, we can find this in our scene manager. Just underneath default player start, we have default camera. And I'm going to create a new one just by clicking create to the right of it. select it, and you can see we've got a blue screen as our camera preview, and that's only because it's in the same plane as our set geometry. So I'm just going to pull it back a little bit, like so. I want the camera to be able to follow the player, so I'm going to zoom in a little bit. I'm going to give it a size of about 2.5. And I'm going to uncheck both the vertical movement and horizontal movement locks. And that means that it's going to follow the player in both directions. So you can see the camera is now following. Now there's a few things wrong with it. The camera is centering in on the player's feet, and that's because it's centering on the player's origin. So the first thing I'm going to do is raise the vertical movement's offset value. Not too high, maybe about 1.47, 1.45. Looks about right. And I think the camera maybe moves a little too slowly. It takes a little bit too much time to catch up with the player. So I'm going to raise the follow speed to maybe 1.3. Now you can see that as we get too far to either the right, left, or bottom of the screen, we start seeing the edges, or we start seeing beyond the background sprite. So what we want to do is we want to lock the camera to minimum and maximum values for the horizontal and movement axes. So let's start with the horizontal, that's this direction, the X direction. I'm going to check constrain within the horizontal movement panel, and the camera moves back to the 0 because it can only have a minimum and a maximum value of both 0 by default. So I'm going to raise the maximum. It takes a little bit of trial and error, maybe 2.2. So it now can't go beyond an X value of 2.2. And because this scene is mirrored, I know that minus 2.2 is going to be a good minimum. And for the vertical, I'm going to do the same thing. We don't need to worry about the maximum, but I'll lower the minimum down to something like maybe minus 1.2, 1.1. Now, you may know that when you exit Unity, it sort of forgets certain changes that you've made in your editor. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy these component values and paste them in when we stop playing. So in my Game Camera 2D component, I've chosen Copy Component. When I exit playing, all of these changes have been reset. So I'm just going to choose Paste Component Values. And now we've got these all made again. When we move around the scene, all of our objects in the background look kind of static. They don't move at a different rate. They don't have any kind of depth effect to them. And that's because we're in a 2D game and our camera is orthographic. But we can cheat a depth effect by using the Parallax 2D script. Let's affect the background sprite here. In our set geometry folder, select Park Background, and then we'll add the component called Parallax 2D. Now we have a few options here. The first option is our depth, and that's how far away from the camera. 0 is no effect, and the greater the value is going to make objects appear further away. And if we wanted to make objects appear closer together, then we could give it a negative value. So I'm going to give this a value of about 0.5. And I want it to scroll in both the X and Y directions, so I'll check these two boxes. And now when we move around the scene, you can see that there's a little bit of lag, there's a little bit of a depth effect going on here. It moves at a different rate to everything else, and it just helps sell the idea of this being a bit more dynamic scene. Now that we have a scene we can navigate, let's go and make something that we can interact with. I'm going to make this tree a hotspot, which means that we'll be able to get some responses when we click on it with the mouse. We can create a new hotspot by going to the Game Editor's Scene Manager, and at the bottom we have something called the Hotspot 2D prefab. And I'll just show you that rather than double-clicking to create one, I can actually single-click in it, then enter in a prefab name that it'll be renamed to. I'll name it Tree, click on Add New, and now we have a new hotspot named Tree in our Hotspots folder. Now it's represented by this yellow cube here, and the yellow cube represents the screen space that the mouse has to be within for the tree to be interactive. So I'm going to stretch it out so that it covers the trunk. are not going to be totally accurate. If we wanted to make use of a polygon collider, we could do that to really be specific about the area, but a stretched out box collider is going to be fine for this. First thing I want to do now is create a walk-to marker. And just as we have a marker to represent our player start, we can also use a marker to represent where we want the player to walk to before we run any interactions. Now this is optional, but it does make things a little bit easier for us. So I'm going to create a new walk-to marker by clicking on Create here. And you can see we now have a marker 2D :tree. I'm going to bring it down so that it's just beside the tree. If I zoom in, you can see that it's represented by this green arrow. And I'm going to rotate it so that it's facing upright. So back to the tree hotspot. I'm now going to make use of this marker by creating two interactions. I'm going to make a use interaction by clicking the plus, and an examine interaction by clicking the plus again. Context-sensitive mode, which is the interaction mode we're in, makes things easier for us to have use and examine interactions. Our use interaction will be performed by clicking on the left mouse button, and the examine will be by clicking on the right mouse button. And in each of these interactions, we have a player action field. At the moment, this is set to do nothing for both, but I'm going to change it to walk to marker. And that just means that the player is going to walk to this marker before doing anything else. And I'm going to check face after moving, which means he's going to face the direction that this marker is pointing after reaching it. But I'm going to leave cutscene after moving unchecked. And that means that while he's walking to this marker, we can click somewhere else in the screen and it's going to cancel that interaction. I'm going to start with the use interaction because that's going to be the simpler one. I can create a new interaction object by clicking Create to the beside it. We now have a tree use interaction in our interactions folder, and you can see that beside it we have a little icon here, and that represents the action list editor for this tree. Actions are a way of visual scripting, and if I open it, you can see we have a big window here. If you have a second monitor, I recommend that you use your second monitor for this window. Otherwise, I'm going to drop it in beside the game editor so we have a big vertical space. Now each of these grey boxes represents an action, and an action is a single command that we chain together to create interactions and cutscenes and all the rest. We only have one interaction. It's our by default, this is an engine pause game, and I'm going to change it by clicking on engine to dialogue and then play speech. We're going to make the character talk. So I'm going to change the player, I'm going to check player line because this is our player speaking, and the line text is going to be, I'm a bit too old to go climbing trees. So now if we play the scene, you'll find that the name of the hotspot is appearing above the cursor, and if I left click on it, he's going to walk over and say, I'm a bit too old to go climbing trees. Let's do something a little bit more complex for our examine interaction. Back in the hotspot, I'm going to go to my examine interaction and create a new interaction prefab. This is our tree look. And again, I'm going to click on the little icon to open up its action editor window. For this interaction, we're going to make the camera pan up a little bit to look at the top of the tree, and then he's going to say something like, this is a very tall tree. So the first action type is going to be a camera and then switch, because we're going to switch from our navcam 1 to a new camera. But first, we have to create that camera. And we can do that within the scene manager. We have our game camera 2D button here. And before I create it, I'll name it tree cam. Again, it's in the same plane as the set, so we've just got this blue for our preview. So I'll just drag it out like so. And I'll raise it a little bit to the top and zoom in so that we don't see the edges of the background sprite. That should be enough. And then back in our look interaction, I'm going to assign this tree cam as our new camera. Our transition time at the moment is 0, which means it's just going to be a snap cut, but I'll make it a bit smoother. I'll change it to 2 seconds. And then we have a move method, which is the way it's animated from one to the other. I'm going to change it to smooth, and then I'll check wait until finish, which means it's not going to do anything else until this is run. Let's make a new action afterwards by clicking on or rather holding down the button over this circle beneath the action and dragging out a new wire. And when I release, it's going to make a new action in its place. This new action, I'm going to make another speech action. I'm going to choose dialogue and then place speech. I'll check play a line, and he'll say something like, "That's a big tree." I didn't say that this was going to be a very good game. Finally, we're going to make another action, and just like our camera switch, we're going to make another one. And this is going to return to the original camera. Now, we could use our navcam 1 as our new camera, but instead, imagine that we have several navigation cameras in our scene. We might not necessarily know which one we were using before this interaction runs. So instead, I'm going to check return to last gameplay, and that'll mean that it just uses whichever camera was being used before this interaction ran. I'm going to give it a transition time again of 2, set it to smooth, and check wait until finish. And now when we run the scene, I can right click, he'll look at the tree, say something, and then the camera will return. Now, when we hover over the tree, we don't get any kind of visual feedback so far as the cursor goes. We only have this label above the tree. Let's go into the cursor manager now to go and fix that. The cursor manager is where we can choose all of our different interaction types. And because we're using the default Adventure Creator menu, we have these 3 defaults. We have use, talk to, and look at. Each one has its own texture. And up at the top of this panel, we have change cursor based on interactions. So if I check that, we now have icons appearing. Now we have 2 cogs here. The left cog refers to our use interaction. If I open up my tree hotspot, you can see that we can actually choose what this cursor is. So I could change this to talk to, for example. And now we have a speech icon on the left. But we want the right one, which is representing our examine interaction. We want that to be a looking glass. So in the game editor, in the cursor manager, down at the bottom, we have a field for our examine icon. And I'll change this to look. So it'll now use the magnifying glass for our look icon. But I don't want them both to appear. I'll only want the examine one to appear if we don't have a use interaction. So underneath when use and examine interactions are both available, display the use icon. And I'll check left click to examine when no use interaction exists. So now we have a single use icon that we can still examine by right-clicking. Let's go and create an opening cutscene. Cutscenes are just like interactions that we just made. They are made by chaining together these action nodes. We can find a cutscene prefab down here in our scene manager and clicking on cutscene. But there's an easier way to do some of the more standard cutscene types because we want to have this cutscene run when the scene begins. It's going to be our on-start cutscene, which is listed here in the scene cutscenes panel at the top. We're going to click on the create button just beside it. So now we have a new cutscene that's automatically set to run when the scene begins. And again, I'm going to click on the node icon here, and we'll now chain together some actions that will dictate this opening cutscene. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to have the player appear, first of all, off screen, and he's going to walk into the screen and then face downwards. So first I'm going to make a new marker. Within our navigation panel, I'm going to click on Marker 2D. This will be my marker 2D intro, and I'll position it so that it's off screen. It doesn't matter where what the rotation is, because we're not going to be affecting the player's rotation since he's going to be out of the scene view anyway. And we're going to reuse this player start arrow rather than actually make a separate marker for that one. So first thing we're going to do in our on-start cutscene is we're going to teleport the player off screen. We're going to do that with the object and then teleport action. We'll check is player, and then the teleport to field we'll set to marker 2D intro. And we'll make a new action now. This time it'll be character move to point. Again, we'll check is player. And the marker to reach a marker and player start is available here. So we'll choose our player start 2D. We'll check wait until finish so that it doesn't do anything until then. And then we'll create a final action that'll be the character face direction action. And rather than facing an object, we'll just make him face a particular direction. We'll make him face downwards, or rather down right maybe. So affect player, and then direction to face is down right. And again, we'll check wait until finish. So now if we run the scene, he'll appear off screen to begin with, walk in, and then face down right. You might recall that our player doesn't have any run animations. That's why in the player inspector, the run name field is left blank. But that doesn't mean that he can't run, he just can't play any animations when he does so. We can demonstrate this by double-clicking somewhere, which causes him to run, but he just kind of looks like he's just sliding along. So let's disable the ability to run. And we'll do that by setting up an action list. Now, action lists are a series of actions, just like cutscenes, only they live outside of scenes, they live as asset files, which means they can be run from any scene. In our game editor, underneath the settings, we have a field that says action list on start game. So this is going to be an action list that will run when our game begins, no matter which scene we're starting the game from. I'll create one by clicking create to the right, and it's made a new asset file called new action list. I'm going to rename it to on start game, and I'll actually drag it into a new folder that I'm going to make in my 2D game folder. I'm going to make a folder called action lists, and I'm going to drag that into there. So this action list is going to run when our game begins, and just like our cutscenes and interactions, it's a series of actions. Now I could use the inspector to do so, to edit them, but instead I'm going to use the action list editor so I can use node-based actions instead, just because it's a bit easier to use. You might get an error message in the console, but that can be safely ignored. We're only going to make one action in this action list. It's going to be a player constrain action, and the walk run field is going to be set to always walk. And that means it's going to be called when the game begins, and our player is no longer going to be able to run when we double click. Let's go and create an NPC so that our player has someone to talk to. We're going to make an NPC out of the bird sprites that are in the 2D demo, and you can find them in Adventure Creator, 2D demo, graphics, sprites, and then bird. As we were making the player, you saw that we started from an empty game object, and we're going to do the same here. We'll choose create empty. I'll rename this object bird. I'll reset the transform first before positioning it, just so that the Z depth is the same as our background sprites. And I'm going to add the component NPC. And you can see it's very similar to the player's component. We want to add the sprite of the bird as a child component. So I'm going to choose one of these sprites in here, add it into the scene. It doesn't matter exactly which sprite we're going to be using because we're going to be overriding it with animations. But I'll make this a child object of the bird, reset its transform, and then assign this as the sprite child transform field. We want this bird to get smaller or bigger according to where it is in the scene. So I'm going to add on the follow sorting map component to a sprite and check follow sorting map. And I'm also going to add the animator component so that we can animate him. In order to use the animator, we need a controller. So I'm going to make a new controller in the My 2D Game folder. Right click, animator controller, and I'll call this bird controller. And assign this into the controller field. We can uncheck apply root motion because we don't need that. And we have our pre-made animations in 2D demo animations bird. And as you can see, these animations, unlike brains, don't have underscore and then a directional letter. And that's because the bird is only facing left the whole time. So it's going to be a bit more simple. Let's drag in these animations into the animator window and enter the names of them into the standard 2D animations panel. Our idle name is bird idle. We don't have a walk or a run animation, but we do have a talk, and it's called bird talk. As I was saying, we don't have any directions, we only have the one, so I'll uncheck multiple directions. And we want to add a few more components now. We're going to start with a circle collider. And this is going to act as a barrier for the player. So when the player is walking around, he's going to pick up on the circle collider and navigate around him when he's pathfinding. I'll make it a little bit smaller because it's a little bit too big. 0.3, 0.35. And I'm going to add a hotspot component because it's the hotspot component that we need to be able to interact with him. And a hotspot component needs a new collider, and this one's going to be a box collider 2D. I'll reduce the size of it a little, and this needs to be a trigger collider. Now, it might look a little odd to have two colliders very similar in size on the same object, but if we were making a more humanoid character, such as the player here, our box collider would span the whole width of the sprite, whereas the circle collider would cover just the feet, so that we can navigate around the feet, but click on anywhere on the sprite to activate the hotspot interactions. So that should be it. We should now be able to run the scene. We won't be able to interact with him, but we can see that our bird is sitting there, ready to be interacted with, which we'll be doing in a moment. Let's get these two characters speaking together. We want the player to have choice over what the player character says, so we're going to make use of a conversation prefab. Conversations can be found in the game editor. Underneath scene prefabs and then logic, we have the conversation prefab. I'm going to make a new one called birdconv. And viewing its inspector, we get to enter in the various dialog options that appear on screen. Clicking Add New Dialog Option gives us some fields for each option, including a label. I'm going to add 3 options, and I'm going to set the labels to Hi Bird, and then Wow, a talking bird. And finally, goodbye. And that's all we're going to be doing in the conversation for the moment. We don't need to, or rather, previous version of Adventure Creator required us to create an interaction, that's a type of action list, for each dialog option. But with the more recent release, we're able to define what happens when each of these are clicked within the same block of actions. And that's how we're going to do this. So going back to our bird, remember that we made a hotspot script that behaves just like the hotspot on our tree. We're going to make it so that a left click it begins speaking, so that's going to involve a use interaction. I'll make a new use interaction, and I'll change the cursor to talk to. Our player action is going to be walk to marker, because we want the player to walk over to the bird first, and I'll define our walk to marker now by clicking create up here. I'll position the walk to marker just to the left of the bird, because the bird's always going to be facing that way, and I'll rotate it a little to the right. Go back to the bird hotspot. I'm going to leave cutscene while moving unchecked, but face after moving, I'm going to check. Then the interaction field, I'm going to create a new interaction called bird talk to, and viewing its node editor, but this is going to get a little bit more complex, so I'm going to temporarily drag the action list editor window into a bigger space here. It's going to block our scene view, but we don't necessarily need it for now. Again, if you're using a second monitor, then the action list editor is a good place to put it. Our first action type is going to be a dialogue start conversation, and the conversation field is going to be set to our newly made bird conv. Then check override defaults, and this is what I was talking about. We can now set exactly what happens when we choose each option right here in the same action list. So when he chooses hi bird, that relates to this socket here, and I can drag out a new action by holding down and letting go in some empty space. I'm going to change the action type to a dialogue place speech. This is going to be a player line, and I'll set the line text to the same as the label. It's going to be hi bird. And in response, the bird is going to say something back. He's going to say, yo, comma, sup, because he's a cool bird. And when he's finished saying these two lines, we're going to resume the conversation options. We're going to bring the player back to those options so we can choose something else. So we're going to drag the end of the second speech back onto the original start conversation action. Now things are getting a bit cluttered now, so I'm going to collapse these actions by clicking on the arrow to the top left. And I can then rearrange them so things are a bit neater. Let's move on to the second option, wow, a talking bird. Again, I drag out a new action. I'll change it to play speech. This is going to be a player line, and the line text is going to be wow, a talking bird. Again, we're going to have a response from the bird, and dialogue play speech. Maybe I was a little bit hasty last time. I didn't show you. What I'm doing is I'm setting the speaker to our bird NPC, and the line text is going to be, and a hungry one. Can you get me some food? And I'm actually going to place that on a separate line using a carriage return. And again, what we want to do is we want this to resume the dialogue options. So I'm going to drag it back onto the conversation action. Finally, let's work on the goodbye option. I'll make a new action. Again, dialogue play speech, play a line, and he'll say goodbye. And this isn't going to resume the conversation, this is going to end it, so I'll just leave the end of this socket blank. Now we can test our conversation. We can walk over. Notice how when the mouse hovers over the bird, we get the talk icon, and we get our different options that appear here. But notice that we can say, wow, a talking bird, before we even know that the bird can talk. So let's make it so that we first have to say hi bird before this option appears. First thing we need to do is go back to our bird conv, and selecting wow, a talking bird, disable it. So our uncheck is enabled, and that means that it won't appear when the scene begins, or rather the first time that we start the bird conversation. Then going back to our talk action list, we're going to amend this slightly so that when we've finished the first set of actions, it'll turn on the second label. Let's move these out the way so that we can see what we're doing. You can marquee select actions to drag multiple around at once. Now remember here, these are the two actions that correspond to the first label, and it's after these that we want the second label to then become enabled. So rather than immediately going back to the conversation, I'm going to make a new action instead, and this action is going to be a dialogue toggle option. The conversation we're going to affect again is our bird conv. We'll select wow a talking bird, and then we choose what we do to it. We're going to set it to on, and then it'll be this action that goes back to the conversation. I can collapse this, and now you'll see that when we play the game, we only have two options, but when we say the first one, we can then get the second one as well. So as part of the conversation we just made, our little bird friend here asked us to find him some food. So let's make a worm that we can have on the ground, and when we click on the worm, Brain puts it into his inventory. We're going to start with the sprite itself. The worm sprite we can find in Assets, Adventure Creator, 2D Demo, Graphics, Sprites, and then Worm. I'll drag the worm sprite into the scene, place it down somewhere here in the middle of the grass, and I'll put the sprite itself into the set geometry folder just to keep things neat. I'm then going to make a hotspot that will cover this sprite. Again, in the scene manager, I'll choose hotspot 2D. I'll name this one worm. Click on add new, and I'll reposition and resize this worm hotspot so that it covers the sprite. Now, before we go and define what happens when we click on this hotspot, let's go and create a worm inventory item, which is separate to this sprite and hotspot. And this is what will actually exist in our inventory bar. In our game editor, go to the inventory manager, which is just beneath scene. And here we can create and manage all of the inventory items in our game. Let's create a new item by clicking Create New Item. And the name of this item is going to be Worm. The texture is going to be Worm again, but there's two we've got to choose from. Worm-icon is the one we want. The rest we can leave alone for the moment. As long as we've actually got a new inventory item declared, this is fine for now. So in our hotspot for our worm, we've got a interaction to make. The cursor we'll leave as use, and again we'll set a player action of walk to marker. Check face after moving, and create a new marker, and position it just to the top right of the worm, having it facing down right. And that's because we only have a set number of animations that we can play because we're using the 2D Demo's graphics. And one of those animations, which you can find in 2D Demo Animations Brain, is called Brain Take Ground _DR, which stands for down right, which means he needs to be positioned to the top left of the worm here so that it'll look correct. So let's make our interaction now. Going back to our worm hotspot, we'll create our interaction for this use, and open up the node editor. And I'm now going to drag this back into this vertical space here so that we can see our scene while we're working. Our first action is going to involve Brain bending down to pick it up, So the action type will be character animate. And you can see that the controls for this action are quite barren, and they don't appear properly until we've selected a character. So this is going to be a player, and now we get options that are specific to the player's animation engine that we've chosen. The method is going to be play custom, which is what it's already set to, and the clip is going to be the name of the animation we want to play. That's brain take ground _dr. But I'm just going to type in brain take ground without the extra _dr, because I'm going to check add directional suffix, which means it'll add that on automatically based on the direction that he's facing. And we know that he's going to be facing to the down right when this begins. Let's check for the moment, wait until finish, and return to idle after as well. We'll create a new action after this, and we're first going to make the worm sprite invisible. So I'll make a object visibility action. The object to affect will be our worm sprite. The visibility will be invisible. We'll now disable the worm hotspot. So I'll make a hotspot enable or disable action. And the hotspot to affect will be worm. Changing to make disabled. And as a final action for the moment, we'll make an inventory add or remove action, and we're going to add the worm, which at the moment is the only option we have. Let's run it and see what happens. We have a little cog icon that appears when we hover over the worm, and if we click on it, brain will bend down, pick it up. You can now see we can't click on a worm, we can't see the worm, and we have a worm in our inventory. But it didn't look quite so polished. If I play that again, we'll see that the brain has to complete his picking up animation before all of these changes happen. So let's have these changes happen while he's at the bottom, while he's halfway through his animation. First of all, I'm going to collapse these three actions because they're all going to happen simultaneously, and we're going to be adding some actions in and around them. I'll marquee select them and drag them out of the way because I'm going to add a new action in between them. And this new action will be the default engine pause game. Now the default action that appears is always set in the actions manager. That's the third of these 8 managers. And in here, this is just an aside by the way, but in here you get a list of all the actions that are available, and if you find the engine pause game, you can see that it's the default. And if you click on any of these, you can bring up some properties and also make that one the default if you prefer. So we want the game to wait a small amount of time until he's down at the bottom. So we'll set the wait time to about half a second. Then we'll reconnect it back up to these three, the visibility and hotspot actions and so on. And finally, we're going to make one more character animate action, because it's in this action that we will reset the character to idle. So in our first character animation, I'm going to uncheck wait until finish. And this new animate action, I'm going to set the method to reset to idle. And it has an option, wait for animation to finish. I'm going to check that, so it'll wait until his take ground animation has finished playing, and then he'll return to idle. Let's go ahead and make some things happen when we start using our new inventory item. In our inventory manager, within the properties box for our selected item, we can define what happens when we use it and examine it when clicking on it within the inventory bar. And this is very similar to the use and examine interactions that we can define in a hotspot. The use interaction will override the ability to select it when we left click on it. That is, select it so that it becomes the cursor and then we can drag onto something else. So instead of doing that, let's define an examine interaction that will happen when we right click on it. Click on the create button just to the right of it and we'll get a new action list asset. The error that appears can be ignored, and inventory interactions need to be placed in action list assets because they can't live in a scene, because we want this to run no matter what scene we're currently in. I'll move this into my action list folder and I'll rename it to examine worm. Viewing its inspector, I can access the action list editor, and what's going to happen when we right click on the worm is we're just going to have the brain say something. The action type will be dialogue play speech, a player line again, and he'll say, I don't know why I'm holding this. As for using our worm on a hotspot, that's done within the hotspot itself. So because our bird here asked for it, let's make it so that we can give it to him. If I select the bird and find his hotspot, we've got a box for our inventory interactions. So if I create a new one, I then get to choose what kind of inventory this works for. We've only got one at the moment, so it's selected to worm by default. It's enabled. Our player action is going to be walk to marker, again facing after moving, and we'll create a new interaction. And what's going to happen is Brain's going to give it to him. We will start with a character animate action. This is the player, and the animation this time is going to be 2D demo, animations, and then Brain. And we've got, well, the one that seems most appropriate isn't perfect, but brain take mid underscore UR. And again, we're going to use the directional suffix, which means we can just type in brain take mid. This time we do want it to wait until finish and return to idle after. And what's going to happen is he's going to give up the worm, so we'll first need to use an inventory add a remove, and we'll remove the worm for our inventory. And then we'll have a dialogue play speech in which the bird will say, oh boy, worms, my favorite. Let's try that now. So we can right click on this and left click and then left click again on the bird. And we no longer have it in our inventory. There's a few more things we can do. First of all, in our settings manager, underneath inventory settings, we can enable drag and drop inventory so that we don't have to click twice. We can just hold the mouse button down here and then let go on the bird. But what if we wanted to use the worm on something else? Now, it might not make sense to use the worm on the tree, but we still want the player to say something. We still want some kind of recognition that we've done something. Back in our inventory manager, in the inventory worm properties, we have an unhandled interactions section. We have an unhandled use on hotspot and unhandled combine. And this means these are interactions that will run if we don't have a interaction defined. But this is specific to the worm, and what we can do is we can also supply a global variant of both of these, which means we can choose a unhandled use on hotspot asset that will run if we use any inventory item on a hotspot that we haven't defined an interaction for. I'm going to call this new action list unhandled hotspot. Place it in my action list folder. Open up the action list editor, and again it's going to be a dialog place speech, apply a line in which he says, I can't use that there. So now I can drag and drop. I'll just hold this down, and if I let go on the tree, we'll get that unhandled response. So I'm here playing the game we've got so far. I've picked up the worm, and if I drag it onto the bird, then we can give him something to eat. But if we then choose the second option that we have in our conversation, the bird will then say something about being hungry and asking for some food. So we want to add some logic to our game so that the bird says something differently if we've already given him the worm. And to do that, we're going to make use of variables. And if you're familiar with programming, then variables in Adventure Creator are the same as you get in coding. If not, then hopefully things will make sense as we progress. So for this variable that we're going to make a Boolean, because a Boolean is good for things that can either be on or off, or two states. And whether or not, and so far as giving the worm to the bird, we've either done it or we haven't, which is why a Boolean is appropriate here. We can find variables in our variables manager, and we have two types of variables that we can make. We can make global and local. And global variables will exist and can be accessed regardless of which scene we're in at any point in our game. And local variables will only exist in the scene in which we make them. So it's always a good idea to work with local variables whenever we can, just so that we don't clutter up our global variables needlessly. So this is going to be a local variable. Let's create one now. And I'm going to label this given worm. Our type is going to be a Boolean, and its initial value is false, and that means that when we start the game knows that we haven't yet given the worm. The next thing we want to do is set this to true at the right time, and the right time is when we drag the worm onto the bird. So let's look at that interaction that relates to the bird:worm interaction. And if I open up its node editor, you can see that at that point we animate the character, we remove the worm from our inventory, and the bird says, oh boy, worm's my favorite. So let's add another action, and this is going to be a variable set action. We're going to change the source to local, and the variable, well, we've only got one variable, so it's already set for us, given worm, and the statement is going to be changed to equal to true. And we can test this out by playing our game, and in our variables manager, I'm going to check show real-time values. And you can see that our given worm Boolean is currently set to false. But if I drag the worm onto the bird, when he's finished speaking, this will be changed to true. So we can use this Boolean value to make the bird say something different. And what the bird says when we talk to him in our conversation is placed in our bird talk to interaction. So I'm going to open that. And again, this is quite a big action list, so I'm going to move this to a bigger space. And we want to work on the wow, a talking bird dialog option, because that's the middle one. That's when the bird will say that he's hungry. and that corresponds to these two actions here, this action branch. So we're going to go and edit these. What I'm going to do is I'm going to just select these, move them a little out the way so that we have a bit of space to work with, and expand them so that we can remind ourselves what these two actions do. So our first is our player saying, wow, talking bird, and then the bird says that he's hungry. So this is the action that we want to change based on the value of our variable. So I'm going to, in between these two actions, create a new one, and this is going to be a variable set action. Sorry, a variable check action. And the source, again, is going to be local. The variable is already set to our given worm. And the statement, as it's already set for us, is that we're going to be checking that the variable is equal to true. Now, it's not equal to true when we begin the game, and that means that the condition is not met. So I'm going to take this output socket, the bottom one, and connect it to our existing action, existing speech action. And that basically means that when this series of actions run, and we have not given the worm to the bird will say this line of speech. Now, when the condition is met, we can determine that with this output socket. So I'm going to drag a new action out here. This is color-coded, so green is correct, red is false. And this is going to be another dialog play speech action. We're going to make the bird the speaker, and he's going to say, and a hungry one, too. So now let's play our game. We can pick up the worm, and I'll just show you the difference. I'll choose wow, talking bird before we've given the worm, and he'll ask for some food. Let's now give him some. And when we talk to him again, you'll see that he says something different. Let's go and make our UI a little bit more attractive. You can see that we do a lot of speaking in this tutorial. And when we do so, we get this subtitles box that's the default subtitles box that comes with the default Adventure Creator menu. And we have the name of our speaking character up here. The subtitle text scrolls in from the left, and it's all surrounded by this ugly grey box. And the lines always appear down at the bottom of the center of the screen here. So let's go and make things a little more traditional, more like most 2D games. We'll have the text of the speaking character appear above their heads and get rid of the black box, and maybe we'll change the color of the subtitle text itself as well. We can control all of these things in the menu manager. In our game editor, choose menu. And again, because we're using the default Adventure Creator interface, we have all of these menus pre-made for us. But it's not very attractive, and it's really just there as a basis for us to adapt and make our own. So the subtitles are displayed in our subtitles menu here. And because I have the game window selected, I can preview the menu here. We could also use Unity's UI system for menus, but in this tutorial I'm going to be just covering the Adventure Creator menu system instead. Now, menus are made up of elements inside them, and it's the elements that actually get displayed. Menus have properties that are listed here. You can see that our subtitle menu has a bunch of properties. We can control its position with these sliders, or its size, and so on. The conditions under which it appears. This subtitles menu is set to appear when speech plays, which is what we want. And we have two elements inside our speech box. The elements are both label types. Menus can have several different types of elements. You can see we've got things like buttons and inventory boxes and so on. Now these two labels, the first one is our speaking character label, the one that displays who's speaking, and the label type is set to dialogue speaker, and that's how that works. The subtitles line itself has a label type of dialogue line, and it's by setting that label type that we can get more settings and so on, and Adventure Creator will use that to display the speaking text. So the first thing I'm going to do is remove the name of the speaking character. I can auto-select any of these elements just by clicking on them in the game window. I'm going to, with the sub-speaker label element selected, I'm going to click on the cog to the right and choose delete. Now I'm going to work on this label here. So I'm going to, first of all, remove the background texture. I'm going to change the background texture from this gray texture asset to none. That does make the text itself a little bit hard to read, so I'm going to change the text effect to outline and raise the text size to around about 3. I can make the element box itself a little bit bigger with this size property, so I'll raise the height, and I'll change the text alignment to middle center. The menu itself is quite a bit bigger than the element, so what I'm going to do is back in the elements properties, I'm going to change the size from manual to automatic, and that'll just mean that it takes up no more space than the elements inside it. I'll set the transition type to none, and I'll change the position type from manual to above speaking character. You can see then this icon appears in the middle of our view, and that's really just a reference point. So when we have our position above speaking character, we can use this as a relative point of, like a point of reference. So if you imagine this is the top of the character, the top of the character's head, I'm going to raise the position so that it appears like, say about there, so that the subtitles will appear just above the character. Finally, I will go to our speech manager, where I get a few options about the way subtitles work in general, and I'll uncheck Scroll Subtitle Text. So let's see how our menu appears when we speak. And you can see it's a lot more like traditional 2D adventure games. Let's go ahead. Oh, actually, you can see our menu is a little bit too not deep enough, because you can see we've got the end cut off here. So back in our subtitles, subs line label element, I'm just going to raise the height a little bit more. Now we can go a little bit further and change the color based on who's speaking. So in our properties list, we have our label type set to dialogue line, and that'll affect the various properties that appear beneath. And we have an option that says use character text color, which I'm now going to check. And our My Player and Bird NPCs both have a property underneath dialogue settings in which we can set the speech text color. So I'm going to make Brains blue, and I'll leave the birds as white. Actually, I'll make a little bit lighter blue, something like that. So you can see our subtitles interface is already looking a lot nicer now. Let's now move on to saving and loading, which is a crucial part of any adventure game. Before we can test out our save system, we need to save this scene and add it to our build settings. I've already saved the scene in my 2D game and then tutorial. So I'm going to save, or I'm going to add it to the build settings from File, Build Settings, and then click Add Current. So let's see what happens when we save our game already. I'm going to first click on the worm so that it's now in our inventory. So let's save the game. I'll save over save 1. We get a few error messages in the console, but let's ignore that for now. If I stop the game and then replay it and load this game, I can access the save and load menus either by pressing escape or by choosing the in-game menu down here. If I load that previous save 1, you can see that Brain is now standing where we left him. We have our worm in our inventory, but our worm hotspot and worm sprite are still there, whereas they should have been removed. And that's because Adventure Creator will always save whatever it knows that it has to. It knows that it will always have to save the position of the player. It knows that it'll always have to save the inventory we're carrying and the state of our various variables. But as for various scene hotspots, or scene objects rather, we need to be very specific about what Adventure Creator saves. And that's done very easily just by adding appropriate scripts. If we go into our logic and conversation folder, we can see that our birdconv object has a little disk icon beside it. And that just tells us that it's already marked up for saving. And if I click on it, you can see that the remember conversation component is already attached, and that's actually part of the prefab. And this component tells Adventure Creator that this is a conversation that we want to save the state of. Now this conversation will change over time as we play our game, because remember that the wow, a talking bird dialogue option will become enabled at some point when we're playing. So we want that state to be recorded, and that's done by marking up this object with the remember conversation component. So we want to add similar components to our worm or the worm hotspot and the worm sprite, and we also want to mark it up with our camera, because although we only have one camera to begin with, we may have several cameras that we can have active when we're playing the game, and we need a way to tell Adventure Creator that we can save that. Let's work on our worm first. We can select the worm hotspot either by clicking on it, finding it in the hierarchy. I'm going to show you a slightly different way, even though it's not strictly necessary, but it's good to know. In our game editor, choose Scene Manager, and if I click on Hotspot, then I get a list of the existing hotspots that exist in our scene. I'm going to choose Worm, and then Select. And that's now selected my worm hotspot. So this hotspot will be disabled when we pick the worm up. So I'm going to go to my inspector and add the component Remember, and then from this choice list of choices, I'm going to choose Remember Hotspot. And that means that this hotspot will now be, the on-off state of the hotspot will be remembered in our save game. Let's do the worm sprite now, and if you remember, it's hiding underneath the hotspot at the moment. That's found in our set geometry folder, and then worm. The worm is going to be made invisible when we click on the worm to pick it up. So I'm going to add the component remember visibility, and that will tell Adventure Creator to store the visibility of this object. Finally, we'll do the camera, which we can find in Cameras, Game Cameras, Navcam 1. Now we don't have a remember camera script, but that's because we don't need to remember anything about the camera. We just need the camera itself to be present in save games. We just need, because nothing is going to change with our camera while we play the game. None of these values here are going to be affected. So we just want to store a reference for our camera. And we can do that by adding the constant ID script. And you can see now that we have a number generated. It's also listed here in our console. And that's just a unique value that Adventure Creator can use to refer to this object in its save game files. Now let's test our scene again and see what happens. Actually, I forgot to save. So again, I'm going to pick up the worm and move over somewhere else. We have the hotspot and sprite disabled. The worm is in our inventory, and I'll save the game. And if I restart the scene and load back, you can see that the worm is now hidden. This tutorial is nearly over, but I'm just going to add one last bit of polish, and I'm going to add a shadow to our player character here. You can find a shadow graphic in Adventure Creator, 2D Demo, Graphics, Sprites, and then Brain. We have a sprite called Brain Shadow, which I'll drag into the scene. And I'm going to attach it as a child of the main sprite graphic, like so. I'll then reset the transform, maybe raise it up a little bit, like so. And we now need to make sure that it will follow the sorting map in the same way that our main sprite does. So I'll select the main sprite, and in the follow sorting map component, I'll make sure that also affect children is checked, and offset original order I'm also going to check. This is, we will need to make sure that edit mode preview is unchecked while we do this. So I'm going to set the base sprite's order in layer to 0, and we always want the sprite to be placed underneath or be displayed underneath the main sprite. So selecting Brain Shadow, I'm going to give this an order in layer of -1. Although we now can't see it because it's now underneath the ground, but it'll come back. The point is that because we have offset original order, all of the values in our sorting map will be added to the original values here. So because Brain's body sprite has an order in layer of 0, there's not going to be any offset, it's just going to be the value of the sorting map. But because Brain Shadow is -1, it means it's always going to be 1 less than the body sprite. So I'll just apply the prefab back to the source. And when we play the game, we've now got Brain's sprite, and it'll always be underneath the main. We've now got the shadow sprite, and it'll always be underneath the player character sprite. So that's it for this tutorial. You can find out more tutorials on the Adventure Creator website. There are video and text-based tutorials. The text-based tutorials tend to be more in depth about specific features, and you can find all of them by going to the top toolbar here and choosing Adventure Creator, Online Resources, and Tutorials.